Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, J.P. Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 42, The Testament of Yaroslav. Yes, I know, I said I would be talking about life in Rus, but as I was writing it, it kept heading off into periods too far removed from where we are now, so I've decided to defer that to a century or so later in our narrative, and this will be a short connecting episode between Vladimir and Yaroslav, the men who built Rus, and their successors who divided it among themselves. So, we arrive at the last days of Yaroslav. The tale covers this in just a couple of paragraphs, so let's read the whole thing. Quote, 1054. Yaroslav, the great king of Rus, passed away. While he was still alive, he admonished his sons with these words, My sons, I am about to quit this world. Love one another, because you are brothers by one father and one mother. If you live in friendship with each other, God will dwell among you, and you will subject your enemies to you, and you will live in peace. But if you live in envy and dissension, quarreling with one another, then you will perish and bring ruin to the land of your ancestors, which they won with great effort. Therefore, remain at peace, brother heeding brother. The throne of Kiev I bequeath to my eldest son, your brother Izyaslav. Heed him as you would have heeded me, that he may take my place among you. To Sviatoslav I give Chernihiv, to Vsevolod Peryaslavl, to Igor the city of Vladimir, and to Vyacheslav, Smolensk. Thus he divided the cities among them, commanding them not to violate one another's boundaries, and not to steal from each other. He laid on Izyaslav the duty to aid any party that was wronged, if one brother should attack another. Thus he admonished his sons to dwell in amity. Being unwell, he came to Vyshgorod, and there fell seriously ill. Izyaslav was in Novgorod, Sviatoslav in Vladimir, and Vsevolod was with his father, for he was his father's favourite son, and Yaroslav kept him at his side. The end of Yaroslav's life drew near, and he gave up the ghost on the first Saturday after the feast of St. Theodore, February the 19th. Vsevolod bore his father's body away, and laying it on a sled, he brought it to Kiev, while priests sang the hymns, and the people mourned for him. When they had transported the body, they laid it in a marble sarcophagus in the church of St. Sophia, and Vsevolod and all his subjects mourned him. All the years of his age were 76. Izyaslav then took up his abode in Kiev, with Sviatoslav in Chernihiv, Vsevolod at Peryaslavl, Igor in Vladimir, and Vyacheslav in Smolensk. End quote. For someone who spent a solid couple of decades fighting for his throne and a large part of his rule going to war, Yaroslav lived to a ripe old age, and this section of the tale, which often gets referred to as the Testament of Yaroslav, shows him trying to resolve the questions of succession better than his father Vladimir did. I don't think it's any real spoiler at this point to say that Rus does not survive as a united kingdom. As you heard Christian Raffensperger say in the last episode, we ought to question our assumptions about whether it should have. So in this episode, I'm going to look at the question of succession in Rus more generally. We probably tend to think of primogenitor, the firstborn being the heir, as the default. But that has actually been the exception to the norm for most of history. Just like the idea that all states should tend to centralization, the idea that a ruler should have a sole heir is a stereotype drawn from the history of a particular place, and it simply does not universally apply. Other options include inheritance by any designated member of a family, clan inheritance, any designated heir irrespective of whether they're related or not. Some places allow a wife to inherit her husband's throne, some do not. Some societies did not develop the idea of inherited rule at all. A part of what we might call the traditional narrative of Rus history is that the rulers of Rus and the states that have claimed to be its successors are members of a dynasty descended from Rurik, known as the Rurikids. However, this idea is actually a modern invention. And just to be fair, I have to note that although it may have become most entrenched in Russia, the rulers of other polities claiming succession to Rus also developed similar claims. The idea of the Rurikid dynasty as we know it was thought up in Muscovy 3 centuries after Rus fell to the Mongols. Like all such royal myths, it was intended to legitimize the rulers of Muscovy by appealing to their ancient ancestry, an approach to the right to rule that became especially important in the early modern age. However, we do not have any indication that the contemporary people of Rus thought in those terms. If you cast your mind back over the last few episodes, you'll recall that the whole question of where the rulers of Rus came from was rather obscure. We have no direct evidence that Rurik actually existed. The first few rulers, mentioned in the tale of bygone years, have an unclear connection to him and to each other. The same goes for other chronicles like the Novgorod Chronicle. Rurik appears there as the leader of the Scandinavians who take a town on the northern lakes, but is barely ever mentioned again. There are chronicles that start the rulers of Kiev with Askold and Dir, and leave Rurik out completely. What we actually see throughout the tale is rulers claiming the throne on the basis that their father, brother, uncle, and very occasionally grandfather ruled in Kiev or some other city. There are no appeals to any extended dynasty beyond their own immediate family. For this reason, many scholars prefer to call the extended ruling clan of Rus the Volodymyrovichi rather than the Rurikids, because we can't trace them back to Rurik, but we can trace them to Vladimir the Great. When the Muscovite monks first began constructing dynastic lineages for their rulers, they also turned first to building a tree back to Vladimir, the Christianizer of Rus, rather than the pagan Rurik. However, by this point in history, royal families were bidding to outdo each other in the ancientness of their origin. The British, for example, claimed to be descended from Brutus, a Trojan descended from Aeneas, who somehow ended up in the Atlantic. Nearer to home, on the Baltic, the Lithuanians were claiming that they were descended from 500 Roman families a relative of Nero called Palemon led into the north. So Macarius, the metropolitan of Moscow, decided that the Danilovici, the ruling house of Muscovy, were part of the Rurikid dynasty, descended from Rurik, and beyond him, ultimately, from some guy called Prus, allegedly a relative of Caesar Augustus, who had given his name to Prussia. This means that when we are looking at the Volodymyrovici, which means the sons of Volodymyr, the Ovich suffix means son of, and Ovna means daughter of, we are looking at people who had not developed the idea that they were part of a ruling dynasty, who were actually presenting themselves on the basis that I rule because my brother or father ruled, not because I am the scion of an ancient family appointed by God to rule since time immemorial. Christian Raffensperger argues that it's more appropriate to think of them in terms of families which connect together into a larger clan than a dynasty. He points out that using the traditional view of dynasties can obscure the familial relationships. If, for example, we treat Yaroslav's wife, Ingigerd, as just a royal wife of the Rurikids, rather than a member of the Swedish royal family in her own right. Yet we see the importance of connections to Scandinavia throughout this period. There is an argument in studies of medieval Europe that the Germanic kinship structure, which includes Scandinavia, was, before the year 1000, based around both male and female connections, but after it shifted towards a strictly patrilineal model. That is, earlier, the connections to your wife or mother's family were just as important as your connections to your father's family, but then the connections through the female side lost their importance. This argument has been criticized as simplistic, but scholars continue to debate what family has meant at various times in history. I'm sure the idea that the nuclear family of mother, father, and children is a modern phenomenon is not new to most of you, but you will find endless arguments over what a family was at various points in history as well as in different societies. Raffensperger's model of the ruling families of Rus has Vladimir the Great as the founding father of the clan who everybody looks back to, and then families comprising a ruler, his wife, their children, and their grandchildren. Obviously, these are shifting units that overlap between generations and also split. A ruler may have two sons who become rulers of two cities, and then each of their families becomes a new ruling family within the greater clan. We will see quite a lot of this. I realize it may be difficult to keep track of the names, but that's just how it is. The basic system of succession in Rus after Yaroslav was collateral. This means that the rulership first passed from the dead king to the king's next brother, then the next brother, down to the fourth brother. And only when the brothers were exhausted did it revert back to the eldest son of the eldest brother, then his next brother, down to the fourth again, then the eldest son of the original king's first brother, and so on. This is a system that is most effective when people have a lot of children and most of them die. Think about the early Scandinavians venturing into the east on dangerous journeys, or the early days of Rus with constant low-level warfare with the steppe. If your brother was lost on a voyage, you took over. If you died defending your town from raiders, then your next brother took over. The problems start if you get too many kids and too many of them survive well into adulthood. If there were too many brothers and you got bumped from the line of inheritance, then that was it for your descendants. If you did not rule in a city, your son would not either, irrespective of his being related to the ruling family. Right up to the end of the Chronicles, we find that only fathers and brothers, and sometimes grandfathers, are cited as evidence for a person's right to rule. No appeals to Rurik or even Vladimir the Great, and certainly no appeals to membership of a dynasty. This is quite an interesting situation. Not quite the clan rule of the steppe, as it was more personally invested, and not the centralizing sole kingship that England or France were heading towards. You can easily see how this system would work against the unified Rus, and the effect is going to be that various cities become divided into the separate patrimonies of various branches of the Vladimirovichy, even if Kiev did remain preeminent in overall military and foreign policy matters. Within 50 years, the rulers of Rus will gather at the Council of Lyubich to formally enshrine this division by giving each of them their land as their domain to be inherited by their families. Their agreement will be similar in key ways to Yaroslav's testament. The principles of the testament are that Rus belongs to the ruling clan, who, as we discussed, are legitimate because, as Yaroslav says, it is the land of their fathers and grandfathers. Second, Rus can be divided among the members of the clan. Third, there is a kind of seniority. Yaroslav first gives Kiev to his eldest son, and then works down the rest, giving them a city of diminishing importance as they get younger. Yaroslav also tacks on that the eldest, the ruler of Kiev, is responsible for making sure that the other brothers hold their property peacefully. What we don't have at all, as we've already noted at other times of succession, is the notion that there is one true ruler and one true heir, even with respect to who gets to be the senior king. So even though Yaroslav was the sole and uncontested ruler of Rus, it looks like he saw that situation as simply the outcome of the wars between him and his brothers, rather than a system of rule that should be perpetuated by succeeding generations. Some historians have argued that there was no division of Rus among sons previous to this. I think I will have to take the side of those who say that there was. We saw that Yaroslav was assigned Novgorod, and he decided to stop paying tribute to Kiev and operate independently. His brothers were also all assigned cities to rule. Going back further, it is hard to tell what was happening or how much Kiev's rule actually extended to other cities. This may not be a division of the kingdom into patrimonies, as will take place later, but it looks like a possible precursor, the root of the underlying idea that it could be. While the later agreement will make the various domains hereditable by the families controlling them, the Testament of Yaroslav does not clarify what is to happen if a brother dies. Should their land go back to Izyaslav, who is in the place of a father in Kiev? Should it pass on to an elder son? Should it be divided again between several sons? And what if there are no sons? Another possibility is that the towns are a kind of seniority ranking. If one brother dies, all the brothers below him could move up a notch. We also need to consider when this Testament of Yaroslav appeared. Did he write it down with his counselors in an attempt to prepare for his death? Did he announce it to his sons and the boyars in a speech? Was it made up after his death as a way to legitimize the actual distribution of the lands and cities of Rus among his sons, which they had decided themselves? It could have been any of these things. As I've previously noted, we are right on the cusp here of the chronicle turning from a tale of half-remembered legends, folk tales, and propaganda into something more closely resembling a history written by order of Yaroslav's grandsons. The testament falls into a gap here, not old enough to be a tradition, not contemporary enough to be treated as reliably reflecting fact. Yaroslav could have written or declared something about how he wished his kingdom to be apportioned after his death. I think that after he had spent 20 years fighting his brothers himself, it would have been quite natural for him to try to avoid all his hard work building the kingdom ending up the same way. But equally, whatever he said or wrote could have been revised or updated after his death to reflect how things turned out and the actual state of political forces. We also have to think about what we have been saying about the law. Although we can accept that Yaroslav made the first attempts to establish some sort of legal system in Rus, do we really think that Rus had become the kind of place where he could say, "These are the rules for inheritance in our dynasty, let them apply henceforth and forever, amen"? I think not. The institutions that would enable that to be the case had not yet evolved. As we have already discussed in this episode, a dynasty as such did not really exist, and neither did an expansive and centralized kingdom. Vladimir and Yaroslav had tried to build one. So when Yaroslav tries to establish what happens after his death, he's breaking new ground, and with the evidence available to us, we cannot tell whether he's adapting an existing tradition of inheritance or inventing something new. So, although future generations might return to this passage to cite it in favor of their legitimacy, any dispensation that Yaroslav made would at the time have been seen as nothing more than guidelines for his own sons. If it was successful, and it's not that hard to see where there is room for conflicting claims and disputes, then it could form the basis for a system of inheritance by successfully operating over time and proving itself. What we are actually going to see over the next couple of centuries until the end of Rus is that although there may be a basic framework, the system of collateral inheritance outlined earlier, it's not set in stone. It will be adapted to fit the facts of individual cases. There will be compromises and accommodations. Sometimes the wishes of the people will have to be taken into consideration. Sometimes the absence of a clear direct heir will mean that somebody else needs to be brought in. However, chaos is generally avoided, although not wars between brothers, and the system largely functions as intended, as you might have guessed by the fact that 50 years later the various branches of the ruling family will be gathering in a council to try to enshrine it in an agreement that is in many ways close to the principles that are set out in the Testament of Yaroslav. In the next episode, we will look at how Yaroslav's sons took up their rule in their lands. How long can peace and harmony endure? Thank you to the new subscribers on Apple Podcasts. Part 1 of the Members series on Central Asia before the Mongols is out, looking at the beginnings of human settlement to the Achaemenid Empire. Alexander the Great, the Hellenistic Age, and the expansion of the Sogdian merchant networks are coming soon. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.